It's late May 1940. The tattered would-be remains of the Allied armies lie in a tense wait for the German blitzkrieg to roll over them for a final time. But the armies would never come, and instead the ever-famous Luftwaffe would be the ones to wipe them out. The pilots of the Messerschmitt Bf 109 were confident. Nothing they had faced so far could put up a fight that could match them. They strongly believed that wherever the 109 flew, there would be victory, and they had little reason to doubt this claim. But as they flew to Dunkirk, they met an aircraft that would throw this confidence aside. An aircraft that would put a stop to their dominance in the skies. An aircraft that they would fear. The Spitfire. It was here in Southampton that the Spitfire was born, at the aviation company Supermarine. Supermarine hadn't made its name creating fighters, however, but instead seaplanes. Racing seaplanes.
The story starts all the way back in 1917, when Supermarine advertised for a personal assistant for the owner, Hubert Scott Payne. The man they chose had impressed Scott Payne so much that he was hired there and then, and his name was Reginald Joseph Mitchell. R.J. Mitchell had no experience in the air industry, instead being trained as an apprentice for a locomotive engineering company, but what he didn't know, he taught himself, and just 2 years after he was hired by Supermarine, he was promoted to chief designer. Later that year, Scott Payne decided he wanted to race in the Schneider Trophy contest, which would shift Supermarine's focus onto making record-breaking, cutting-edge aircraft. The Schneider Trophy was an annual race for seaplanes and flying boats, often seeing hundreds of thousands of spectators. At its peak, Schneider Trophy aircraft would break airspeed world records, and it was incredibly important in developing aviation technology. Many technologies developed for the Schneider Trophy would be adopted in combat aircraft during World War II. Supermarine's first attempt at winning the trophy was in 1919, using a modified flying boat that they had already designed for other purposes, which they named the Sea Lion. Unfortunately, while competing, the aircraft hit some debris in the water and sank, leading to an Italian victory. Later on, however, the Italian entry was disqualified for not correctly going around the course marked by buoys in the water. The next two competitions took a hit from the global financial instability of the time, and only the Italian team completed the circuit, as no other nation entered into the competition in 1920, and in 1921 the only other entry, a French aircraft, wasn't able to start the race. Because of their disqualification from the 1919 race, the Italian team had just fallen short of winning the race 3 times in a row. The first nation to win the Schneider Trophy 3 times in a row would keep the trophy permanently. If Italy won again, then this honour would go to them. But Supermarine's Sea Lion 2 flying boat was the victor in 1922, cutting off the Italian winning streak. In 1923, the Americans joined the fray, funded by the US Navy, who saw the value in such a competition and changed the way that the Schneider Trophy races would be flown. Instead of the flying boat that had been used since the end of the First World War, the American team brought a seaplane. The difference in performance and cost was staggering. R.J. Mitchell had a real challenge on his hands, and this is where the Spitfire truly began. The next year, in 1924, both the British aircraft crashed before the race, and the French and Italians didn't turn up, so the competition was cancelled. Following some financial trouble, James Bird took over the Supermarine company from Scott Payne, but was happy to continue participation in the Schneider Trophy races. By 1925, Mitchell had realised that the age of the racing flying boat had long since passed, and out of this realisation came the Supermarine S4. On its very first flight, the S4 broke the world seaplane speed record, and the British entrance to the 1925 Schneider Trophy went to America riding on high hopes. But the S4 had been designed and tested in the waters around Southampton, a very different area to the course that would be flown in the 1925 race, and during pre-race trials, pilot Henry Beard crashed the plane, meaning that the S4 was unable to compete in the actual race. Beard, although injured, did survive and said that he had lost control of the aircraft due to high wing vibration in the high G turns. So the USA had won the Schneider Trophy 2 times in a row, meaning they only had to win the next race to be able to keep the trophy for good. But by now, the British Air Ministry had started to notice the value of the Schneider Trophy in developing high-speed aeroplane technology, and they were willing to sponsor Supermarine in their efforts to create and fly a winning design. Mitchell began work on the S5. In Italy, the relatively new fascist dictator Benito Mussolini sent out a call to Italian aircraft manufacturers to win the Schneider Trophy at all costs, which would both increase national unity and would display to the world the strength of his fascist nation. But when race day came in 1926, the Supermarine S5 wasn't ready, but the new Italian design, the Macchi M39, was. Flying against the unimproved American design from the year before, it won the race, handing the trophy back to Italy for the first time since 1921. When the 1927 race came around the next year, Mitchell's Supermarine S5 was ready, and while it looked very similar to the S4, it was a great improvement. It dominated the race, watched by 250,000 spectators, who all saw Supermarine's S5s take first and second place. Britain had won the trophy, but now they had to keep it. After the 1927 race, there was a mutual agreement between the teams to extend the time between races to 2 years, meaning that each nation would have more time to design, test, and fly their aircraft. But while Mitchell was designing the S6, the engineering company Vickers wanted to purchase a pre-existing aviation company, one of the options being Supermarine, who were approached with an offer. James Bird, knowing all too well that Supermarine's, and indeed Mitchell's, true potential was locked behind a lack of funds, agreed to sell to Vickers, staying on as managing director. It seems there were 2 main reasons for Vickers buying Supermarine. The first being that there weren't many other logical options to go for, and the second was R.J. Mitchell. Mitchell's talents would have been no secret, and neither was his contract, that stated that if another company were to buy Supermarine, he would be obliged to stay on for at least another 5 years. While Mitchell was away on holiday in 1925, Vickers sent the engineer Barnes Wallis, the man who would later go on to design the bouncing bomb, to try to make changes in Supermarine to maximise its profitability. He promptly sat himself in Mitchell's office and began making changes around the Supermarine factory. Now Mitchell prided himself in his ability to do every job there was to be done in the factory, whether it was at the drawing board designing aircraft or on the shop floor building them. This led to an intense knowledge of the factory he worked in and how everything was done, and indeed a lot of respect from every worker there, as they all knew that he could do their jobs if he ever wanted to.
So when Mitchell returned home to find a new man in his office shuffling his factory around, he was furious, and instantly moved Wallis to the loft and told his staff not to make him comfortable. Wallis complained, and eventually the matter was raised with the Vickers board. But Mitchell threatened to resign if Wallis was not removed from Supermarine, and so, naturally, Wallis was removed from Supermarine and sent back to Vickers. But it wasn't all office drama for Mitchell. He had work to do. He had felt he had bled as much as he could from the Napier line engine that he had been using, and so he went to Henry Royce, co-founder of Rolls-Royce, to request the production of a new engine for his plane. This new engine had over double the power of the engine used in the S5, but with all that power came major cooling problems. Nevertheless, the Supermarine S6 won the race, and 5 days later broke the world airspeed record at 357 miles an hour, or 575 kilometers an hour. Now it was Britain's turn to be one race off permanent victory. But in 1929, a major world event would shake the hopes of Supermarine even being able to develop a new plane for the 1931 race: the Wall Street crash.
With the Wall Street crash and the economic depression that followed, the Air Ministry withdrew funding for British aviation companies for the Schneider Trophy. Of course, both Vickers and Supermarine suffered during the Great Depression, with Supermarine having to lay off a third of their construction staff. Vickers helped keep Supermarine afloat by contracting some of their own work to them. Meanwhile, in their continued bid to win the Schneider Trophy outright for Britain, there was a surge of public support for Supermarine, and money was being raised to fund a new design, but not enough. It would take the rather surprising investment of £100,000 from the very wealthy and eccentric Lady Houston to both give Supermarine the funds it needed to compete again and pushed the government into giving support back to the project, which they eventually did. With the government backing them once again, and the funds needed finally secured, Mitchell's last obstacle was time. Because it had taken Supermarine so long to get to the stage where they could go ahead with designing something for the Schneider Trophy, there wasn't enough time to design a completely new aircraft, so Mitchell began refining the design of the previous race into the Supermarine S6B. One of the issues that he sought to target was the cooling problems of the Rolls-Royce R engine, so he made use of every surface he could, including the enlarged floats, to run radiators through to help cool the engine. He would later refer to the S6B as the flying radiator, and even the pilot had to be careful not to touch the outside of the aircraft, lest he burn himself. Despite all the effort, when race day came, none of the other nations had been able to get an aircraft ready in time, and so the S6Bs flew to an uncontested victory, bringing the trophy home, forever, to their home country, where it still sits today in the London Science Museum. 2 weeks later, they smashed the S6's world record. Meanwhile in the Air Ministry, Hugh Dowding, one of the heroes of the Battle of Britain, was forging a story of his own. He had often challenged the traditional philosophies of those around him, but managed to advance through the ranks anyway. In 1932, the then Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made a famous speech in which he declared that the bomber will always get through, a philosophy that was held by pretty much everyone else of importance. It was thought that a multi-engined larger bomber aircraft would always outperform single-engined fighters, as they did at the time of the speech. Dowding disagreed, believing that a highly sophisticated defence network, with fighters as its frontline force, could defend from a bomber threat. He clearly had some success, as in 1931 the Air Ministry issued Specification F730 to various aviation companies including Supermarine to replace its ageing frontline fighter. The specification ordered a fighter with a minimum speed of 195 miles an hour at 15,000 feet and 4.303 machine guns as armament. Keen to broaden their range of aircraft and draw upon knowledge they had gained from the Schneider Trophy, Supermarine designed the Type 224 for the specification. They requested that the name Spitfire be reserved for them, although this request was denied. In 1934, the prototype went into production. As the specification had encouraged, it was powered by the Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine, despite the engine's many flaws. It had a large gull-wing configuration, which was done to reduce the size needed for the undercarriage and therefore reduce drag, but this also came with its own flaws in the form of lessened stability. Overall, Supermarine's Type 224 was a complete failure when tested, but Mitchell refused to just give up, instead looking to refine his design. The gull wings were abandoned, and a fully retractable undercarriage was installed. The machine guns were moved from the nose to the wings so that they could fire free from the main propeller, and the previously open cockpit now had an enclosed canopy. The design was much more sleek and modern, and being so different to the Type 224, it was called the Type 300. But the Air Ministry had already rejected Supermarine, and so the new design never even got a prototype, while the Ministry chose the Gloucester Gladiator biplane as their new frontline fighter. It was around this time where Mitchell, after feeling unwell for several months, decided to go for a medical examination, only to tragically find out he had rectal cancer and was advised to go for an immediate operation. The operation did what it could, but Mitchell would have to wear a colostomy bag for the rest of his life, one that he was told may not last long, as the cancer would likely return. Most would have chosen this point to retire. Indeed, the great Henry Royce had retired when his cancer treatment forced him to wear a colostomy bag. Mitchell didn't retire, nor did he ever complain, so much so that no one at Supermarine even knew of his disability. And instead of giving up on the Type 300, Mitchell and his team sought to refine the design. The now Sir Hugh Dowding had been one of many that had high hopes for the Type 224, but was sorely disappointed by its performance, with Dowding seeing the static undercarriage as a major flaw in the Type 224's design. Upon hearing that Supermarine was trying to refine it, the Air Ministry's Director of Technical Development, Air Commodore Cave Brown Cave, sent a letter advising Dowding to officially support Supermarine's revised design. Dowding naturally agreed, and the Air Ministry wrote to Supermarine expressing their support for the project. While they did not directly place an order, it was clear that they wanted the innovators of the Schneider Trophy races to create a fighter design that an increasing number of Air Ministry staff believed they sorely needed. One of the primary problems with the Type 224 was its engine. The Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine that powered it only ran at 660 horsepower, and given that the Schneider Trophy engine, the Rolls-Royce R, had run at over 2,700 horsepower, Mitchell knew that they could do better. The Rolls-Royce R was of course too large and impractical for a fighter plane, but Rolls-Royce were developing a new engine, possibly in collaboration with Supermarine trying to develop a proper high-performance fighter. The new engine would go on to power some of the most famous Allied aircraft of the war, from the Hurricane to the P-51 Mustang, from the Lancaster to the Mosquito. But at the beginning it was simply called the PV-12, and was being designed to reach at least 1,000 horsepower. Thanks to Supermarine's great relationship with Rolls-Royce, it was very quickly decided that the new engine would be the one used for Mitchell's redesign of the Type 300. Soon after, Sidney Cam, who was also designing a monoplane interceptor, would use the PV-12 as the engine for his design. 2 years later, the PV-12 would get a name: Merlin. Now that the problem of the engine had been solved, Mitchell and his team sought to further refine their design. One of the failures that they had identified with the Type 224 was the thickness of the wing. Even after the Type 300 was drawn up with its much thinner wing, they weren't satisfied. They didn't just want to fix the thick wing of the Type 224, they wanted to make the new wing as thin as possible. To do this, Mitchell decided to go with an elliptical wing design, which would create more lift, therefore giving more room to make the wing thinner. It had several other advantages too, for example a very wide chord at the wing root, which had several benefits in itself, one being that it meant the wing would be able to more easily accommodate retractable landing gear and more weapons. It also gave the wing much higher stability, meaning that the aircraft would be more stable at very high speeds, like a dive, and it meant that the aircraft could turn much tighter than other aircraft without the wing tearing off, being able to deal with as much as 9G. As 1935 dawned, the Air Ministry awarded an official contract to Supermarine in the form of a completely new aircraft specification created to suit the advancing Type 300, specification F3734. As the year went on, an important change in design from the original Type 300 was requested. There was a growing realisation in the more active and forward-thinking members of the Air Ministry that a stronger armament would be needed on fighters if they were to shoot down a bomber effectively. In addition, it was realised that the only two machine gun manufacturers in Britain didn't have enough designs to fight a war, should a war come to Britain. One of these forward-thinking men, Captain C.H. Keith, toured European machine gun factories to try to find suitable guns to manufacture in Britain. Squadron leader Ralph Sawley also looked at foreign guns to bring over the Channel. One such weapon was the 20mm Hispano cannon, but that was, at the time, seen as too unreliable, certainly at least to fit onto a fighter. Later on, C.H. Keith would call an informal conference to discuss armament for fighter aircraft. Sawley would also attend this conference, as would Keith's scientific officer, Captain F.W. Hill. Keith and Hill presented graphs and calculations made by Hill and his 13-year-old daughter to the men at this conference, who all eventually decided that in order to shoot down a bomber in the 2 seconds that it was expected that a pilot could keep a bomber in his sights, a fighter would need 8 machine guns, double the amount that was currently on the designs of Supermarine's Type 300. It was also realised that the Vickers machine guns that were currently standard in fighter planes would not be adequate for continued production of 8-gun fighters, as spare parts and replacements for the guns left over after the First World War were in relatively short supply. It was therefore decided that a new gun would have to be used, and trials pointed to the Browning machine gun to be the best choice. C.H. Keith travelled to America to try to get a licence to manufacture the guns in England, and after a long tour managed to do so. On Sawley's fervent recommendation, the request to change the 4-gun armament to 8 came in the form of yet another new aircraft specification, F-1035, which also came with a minimum top speed requirement of 310 miles an hour. It soon became apparent that this new specification may already be met by the monoplanes being designed by Supermarine and Hawker, both with their own private specifications. As the Type 300 design became more and more refined, it was time to build a prototype, but this was fraught with constant delay. The first prototype was originally scheduled for October 1935, but then delayed until January 1936 and then delayed further. Finally, in March 1936, the first prototype of the Supermarine Spitfire was ready, K5054. The first tests at Supermarine were successful, with the pilot praising the handling of the plane. Mitchell, however, was disappointed. It had a predicted top speed of 350 miles an hour, but was only able to reach 335 miles an hour. Mitchell was worried that if the K5054 prototype couldn't reach the target speed, then it wouldn't be put into full production by the Air Ministry, as it wouldn't be seen as superior to Hawker's Hurricane, and as the Hurricane was much easier to produce, it would be seen more favourably by the Air Ministry. Thankfully, as Mitchell and his team, in tandem with the test pilots, worked to perfect the prototype further, it reached 348 miles an hour. K5054 was ready to be officially tested by the RAF. Despite the frequency of aircraft tests at RAF Martlesham Base, there was clearly some excitement around Supermarine's Spitfire, and as K5054 was flown after closing hours on the 26th of May 1936, many stayed behind to watch it fly. The test pilot for that day, Flight Lieutenant Edwardus Jones, later recounted that he could see the white hats of the cooks who were lining the road to watch. Such was the novelty of a retractable undercarriage, he almost forgot to put it down when landing, playing it off as a daring feat for some years afterwards. 8 days later, the head of the Air Ministry, Lord Swinton, ordered 310 Spitfires, expected to be delivered by March 1939. While Mitchell continued to show great interest in the Spitfire, often hauling himself over to watch the prototype fly, despite the pain, he moved on to designing something else for the RAF. Under the specification B-1236, the Air Ministry had asked for a 4-engined heavy bomber with a cruising speed of at least 250 miles an hour and a range of 15,000 miles. Mitchell's response was the Type 316 and its two variants, the Type 317 and the Type 318. He dreamed of the idea of his little Supermarine company producing Britain's frontline fighter and their frontline bomber. Naturally, Supermarine's bomber submission was the favourite, with the Short Brothers design being held as a backup. It had an estimated top speed of 360 miles an hour, an operating ceiling of around 30,000 feet, and had a maximum range of 3,500 miles. All of these estimations trumped the attributes of Britain's later frontline bomber, the Lancaster. But, tragically, it seems Mitchell's time was running out. At the end of 1936, his cancer had returned, and despite numerous attempts to halt its advance, it became clear that there was nothing to be done. He spent the beginning of 1937 trying to prepare Supermarine and his family for his death.
As news of Mitchell's illness reached the outside world, those who knew just how important his work was sent letters of gratitude and sorrow. One letter read, "I think I have never told you before how your great services to the RAF and aviation as a whole are valued. I am fully aware, as are all the other members of the Air Council, of the unsparing manner in which you have devoted your great abilities to the task of design, and I wish you to realise that, however incomplete you may feel your work to be at present, we know that you have always given us of your best." Mitchell's replies show his determination to make sure that the Air Ministry kept confidence in Supermarine after he was gone, especially with the Type 317 bomber project, which was starting to seem a more risky choice without Mitchell. But at last, Mitchell's pain became too much. He was finally unable to work, and after a failed last chance visit to a clinic in Austria, he returned to spend his last days at his home. He died at the age of 42, and at his funeral, 3 RAF planes flew overhead and dipped their wings in salute. In his determination to do as much as he could in the face of inevitable death, Mitchell adopted the Blitz spirit before the Blitz even happened. He was resolute in the face of his fate, he was the first of the few.
After Mitchell's death, his chief draftsman Joe Smith became Supermarine's chief designer and would be responsible for its initial production and its continued development. Perhaps the biggest problem that the Spitfire ever faced was actually getting it off the production line. With all its curves, unconventional construction and sleek design, the Spitfire wasn't easy to build and faced numerous delays over the coming years. For all the skill that the Supermarine workers had, the factory floor was never really managed very well, often being seriously disorganised and chaotic. Not only this, but it simply wasn't big enough to build 310 Spitfires in record-breaking time, especially with much of the workforce and factory space being devoted to building Supermarine's flying boats for the RAF. In addition, there were constant design changes being made from the designer's office, changes that may have seemed small on the surface, but in reality every small change could come with a host of construction problems. It became clear that Supermarine's factory couldn't build the Spitfires by themselves, and as their parent company Vickers was busy building Wellington bombers, they would have to subcontract parts to another company. After a long battle with the Vickers managing director, parts of the Spitfire were finally subcontracted, but complaints about the low quality of drawings, as well as the need to retrain staff, meant that the Spitfire's production didn't accelerate as much as it needed to. The issues over the Spitfire's production went hand in hand with the political battles of the time. Germany was clearly building up its military strength, and many in Parliament were outraged at the government's lack of response to the build-up of German aggression. It was clear that in the war that may be coming, the air would, for the first time, play a great role in the success of the victor. Even then, there was controversy over the spending of Britain's air capabilities, and even within those who supported a strengthening of Britain's air force, there was a disagreement about what should be strengthened. Many still firmly believed in the idea that the bomber will always get through, and pushed for the bomber fleet to be built up, and the Spitfire, with all its delays, to be reduced or even cancelled outright. But one worry for those who thought the RAF needed more bombers and not fighters was that the home defence idea relied on a fighter that was capable of actually shooting down attacking bombers, and that the most promising design for this task still hadn't seen any complete Spitfires off the production line. A key believer in the ability of the fighter was the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who eventually won this particular battle to keep funds moving towards fighters like the Spitfire and the Hurricane, ensuring that the Spitfire's albeit troubled production would continue. But in the political war that was raging in Parliament, there had to be casualties. As the head of the Air Ministry, Lord Swinton, was in the House of Lords, he wasn't seen as accountable to the democratically elected House of Commons, and so, to appease the fiery, angry masses in the Commons, Chamberlain sacked Swinton and had him replaced. Swinton had been the man to order the production of the Spitfire merely 8 days after its test flight, and had placed an equally risky trust in the Merlin engine while it was still being developed. Despite all the problems in the Spitfire's production, Swinton constantly had faith in it, being one of the few to see its potential from the very beginning. In an almost cruel jeer from fate, or perhaps a final salute, Swinton resigned at the same time as the test flight for the first Spitfire to come off the production line, K9787. Finally, in July 1938, Spitfires started entering RAF service. The first Spitfire to be taken to the RAF was parked next to a Gloucester Gauntlet, a biplane that had entered service just 3 years earlier. The difference between the two fighters, and now the renewed capabilities of the RAF, stood bare for all to see. Meanwhile, the tension in Europe was ever mounting. A war with Germany seemed more and more likely by the day, and naturally, the idea terrified the people of Britain. They had been told continuously of the devastation of the bomber, and of its inevitability should another war come. Unknown to them, the Luftwaffe was in no shape to launch a large-scale bombing campaign in 1938. When Chamberlain's famous Munich Agreement came that year, many in the Air Ministry were thankful that they had more time to prepare, unaware that the German side was also glad of their added time. Despite the panic following the Munich crisis, as much of Europe realised how unprepared for war it was, the Spitfire was by no means saved. New designs of aircraft, like the Westland Whirlwind and the Bristol Beaufighter, were seen as more desirable by many, who wanted the Spitfire out of production and replaced. Thankfully, just enough resistance was put up to keep the Spitfire in production, which accelerated due to the newly reignited fear of war. A year later, and war finally came. Despite all the predictions over the last decade of what a modern war would look like with new air technology, there was still a degree of uncertainty on what to expect. Indeed, as Britain had focused so much of its defence budget on fighters, it seemed like the strategy would be to wait for the Germans to act first. Chamberlain ordered that no action be taken that might provoke Hitler, and he still held out hope for a peaceful solution. During the phony war that followed, the young, excited Spitfire pilots of the RAF grew bored in their inaction. Some squadrons saw a little action though, with the first Spitfire victory over an enemy aircraft being a Ju-88 bomber attacking Royal Navy ships in Scotland, with another being shot down soon afterwards. Interestingly, Hugh Dowding had been advised not to waste new fighters in the north, as it was unlikely that German bombers would try attacking there because it was out of range of their fighters. Dowding did so anyway, believing that the Luftwaffe may attack in the north precisely because they thought they would see little resistance. His gamble paid off. The first kill in a Spitfire rather tragically came at the same time as the first death that the RAF suffered in combat during the war, in an event that became known as the Battle of Barking Creek. A radar fault and little training in identifying German aircraft saw a Spitfire squadron engage a Hurricane squadron who they thought were enemy aircraft. The Hurricane squadron's squadron leader realised the aircraft coming down on them were British and ordered his pilots not to engage them. 2 Hurricanes were shot down and one of the pilots, Montague Holton Harrop, was killed. Better training in identification, as well as IFF equipment that would help identify friendly craft in the future, was prioritised.
It was at Dunkirk in May 1940 that the Spitfire was really tested for the first time. The British Expeditionary Forces, 3 French armies and the remainder of the Belgian army were stranded, surrounded by the Wehrmacht, who were ready to squeeze away any last chance Britain had of defending itself. But RAF intelligence intercepted an uncoded transmission that revealed that the German army would not advance past the Lee Canal. The German tanks had already stopped outside Dunkirk to wait for the slower infantry divisions to catch up, but continued worries about supply lines, the vulnerability of flanks, marshy ground and the want to reserve tanks for later conflicts meant that they did not advance further. While the German High Command deliberated, Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, persuaded Hitler that he could destroy the Allied armies without the Wehrmacht even having to get involved. The German pilots were confident. They had only faced the RAF so far in the form of Hurricanes, which had fought valiantly, but were not a match for the 109s. But now they fought Spitfires, the weapon that Dowding had so desperately tried to reserve for the inevitable Battle of Britain.
Rather tragically, the work done by the RAF that day was witnessed by few soldiers on the beaches, sometimes because the fighting was happening too high, sometimes because the RAF had been sent past Dunkirk to stop the Luftwaffe from even reaching the beaches, and sometimes because there weren't enough fighters to always be fighting. The animosity between the two branches of defence was so high that RAF pilots were sometimes denied passage across back to Britain. One Spitfire pilot that took part in the battle over Dunkirk was a New Zealander named Alan Deere. He had claimed what might be the first Spitfire victory over a Bf 109 over France while escorting a 2-seater trainer aircraft to rescue a downed pilot. It was a daring mission, and with only one other Spitfire alongside him, Deere's prospects of survival and the mission's success looked quite slim when 12 109s attacked. The Spitfires swung into action, shooting down 3 109s and seriously damaging another 3. Despite the odds, the downed pilot was picked up and safely returned to England. Later on, while flying over Dunkirk, he shot down a Do-17 bomber, but while chasing another, his Spitfire was damaged by its rear gunner, forcing him to land on a beach in Belgium.
After walking to the nearest village and getting his wounds treated to by the locals, he managed to luckily catch a British Army vehicle on its way to Dunkirk. But when arriving at the beaches and trying to board a ship back, he was refused. When he did manage to find a ship that would take him back, he was met with no thanks or praise, but only scathing remarks about the RAF's inability to protect the men on the ground. That must have been disheartening for someone who had spent the last 2 weeks exhaustively flying over France to try to do just that. Nevertheless, when he got back to England, he went straight back to his airfield, got into a Spitfire, and was flying over Dunkirk again within a day of being shot down. A month later, he received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his efforts.
It was after Diaz's first combat against the 109s that he described the performance difference between the two planes, highlighting the problems that the Spitfire would face in its early days, but also the advantages that would carry it through the Battle of Britain and beyond. He said that the 109 was initially faster in the dive, but slower when climbing. While the Spitfire could outturn the 109, it was less capable in a roll. The main problem that early Spitfires faced was a float carburettor failure when performing negative G manoeuvres. Now what does that mean? Well, a carburettor in an engine is responsible for regulating the amount of fuel and air that gets fed into the combustion chamber in an engine. The way an engine works is by having thousands of tiny little explosions within the combustion chambers moving the pistons up and down, which then move whatever the engine needs to, whether that be wheels or a propeller. Now, two things an explosion needs are fuel and oxygen, and making sure there's the right amount of both is what a carburettor does. Part of what allows it to regulate fuel flow into the air is a float chamber, which uses a float and a valve in a similar way to a flushing toilet, to keep a certain amount of fuel in the float chamber. The problem with this float chamber is that if it experienced negative G-forces, the fuel would go to the top of the float chamber instead of the bottom, meaning that no fuel was being put into the engine, and the engine would temporarily cut out. So when a Spitfire went into a dive or rolled upside down, the float carburettor would fail, and the engine would temporarily cut out. The problem became even worse if the negative G persisted, as the float in the float chamber would fall to the bottom, releasing the valve that kept most of the fuel in the fuel tank out of the engine, and so fuel would flood the float chamber and then down another part of the engine, completely shutting it down. In more simple terms, if a Spitfire were to perform a negative G manoeuvre, like a sudden dive or a roll, the engine would cut out, leading to a sudden loss of speed. Naturally, RAF pilots would try to find ways around this and stop their aircrafts experiencing negative G-forces, but sometimes that meant that if they were on the tail of a 109, all the enemy had to do to get away was dive, and a Spitfire was unlikely able to follow quick enough to shoot the 109 down. Given the 109's already stretched range during the Battle of Britain, an evasive dive like this would usually mean that they would have to fly home, so that would have been some comfort to a Spitfire pilot who had just seen his prey dive away from him. It was during the Battle of Britain that the Spitfire finally proved its worth to all the people who had put their faith in it. Göring's plans for the Luftwaffe during Operation Sea Lion, the German plan to conquer Britain, stated that it would take 4 days to defeat the Royal Air Force in southern England and 4 weeks to totally defeat the RAF. RAF Fighter Command had just under 700 planes at their disposal, and the Luftwaffe could muster 2,600 planes to fight over Britain. 1,100 of these were single-engined fighters, nearly all of these being the Bf-109E variant. The Spitfire was more manoeuvrable than the 109 and slightly faster, but at the time Fighter Command didn't have a point-by-point reference to compare their aircraft to the enemy's. Given the disadvantage he knew he had in numbers, Hugh Dowding, who had been made head of Fighter Command when it was created in 1936, kept fighters tightly in Britain, often letting Luftwaffe attacks carry on unchallenged or barely challenged in the Channel. Eventually though, the bigger attacks that Dowding was waiting for came, and slowly more and more fighters were being deployed to fight off the Luftwaffe swarms. Thanks to the earlier problems in manufacturing the Spitfires, some of which were still ongoing, they were still only available in limited numbers. Usually, the Hurricanes of the RAF, more numerous in number and inferior to the 109s, would be sent after the bombers, while the Spitfires would deal with the fighter escort. The Spitfire wasn't designed to dogfight, it was designed to shoot down bombers, but, in a characteristically versatile fashion, it grasped hold of the challenge and was the best at it. Despite the 109s meeting a match for the first time over Dunkirk, the confidence of the Luftwaffe pilots was still not shaken. It was only after coming across the Spitfire more often did they understand the true threat it posed, and they grew to fear its very name. While the Spitfire is generally considered a better fighter than the 109, it wasn't streaks ahead of its opponent, and pilots often had a tough time against greater numbers and the Luftwaffe's superior flying tactics. The RAF bases were getting pummeled, and at the beginning, British factories were only just succeeding in replenishing losses of fighter aircraft. One upgrade to the Spitfire that had been considered from the very start was eventually trialled, the 20mm Hispano cannon. Joe Smith, Supermarine's chief designer, proposed a way to fit them into the Spitfire's wings. Pilots had sometimes complained about the Spitfire's firepower, as the .303 Browning machine guns, although proving to be very effective at short ranges and vitally reliable, were less effective at longer ranges. Spitfires of 19 Squadron were outfitted with cannons, but Dowding was reluctant to commit them to the front lines, as he thought they wouldn't fare as well against the 109s. His concern about these Spitfires only being armed with cannons proved to be justified, as 19 Squadron constantly experienced failures as the unreliable Hispano cannons jammed. Not only did this decrease the firepower of a Spitfire, but if a cannon jammed on one wing and not the other, it would throw one wing out as the cannon fired, instead of just slowing the whole aircraft down if both fired. For now, the armament of cannons proved a failure. It was Adlertag, or Eagle Day, which would mark the substantial German push to finally disable Fighter Command. Despite the masses of aircraft that flew over the channel to challenge the RAF, Dowding was still cautious in committing his fighters, knowing that there would be many attempts to try to bait out fighters to weaken his ability to shoot down bombers where it mattered most. This was getting to the peak of the Battle of Britain, where Spitfires and their pilots would fly up, fight, land to rearm and refuel, a process that took just minutes, and then go straight back up there to fight again. Pilots were in such short supply that some would join the battle with just 10 hours flight experience, flying one of the most advanced aircraft in the world. Despite its complexities, the Spitfire could be quite forgiving to a new pilot. While notoriously difficult to deal with on the ground, if a mistake was made in the air, threatening to put the aircraft into a stall, the Spitfire would shudder, but would remarkably not be pulled into a full stall unless really pushed to. In the end, Eagle Day, which had been riddled with organisational errors and bad intelligence, was a failure for the Luftwaffe. Despite this, Göring kept on pushing, with his arrogant overconfidence still driving him through.
5 days later, on the 16th of August 1940, there were massive air raids launched on the south of England, targeting cities like Southampton with the Spitfire factory, and here in Portsmouth, home of the Royal Navy. The Luftwaffe forces had a massive close fighter escort, and the RAF squadron sent to intercept struggled to shoot down enough bombers. It was on this day, while observing events in an RAF bunker, Churchill privately confided, "Never, in the field of human conflict, was so much owed by so many to so few."
2 days later came what would eventually be dubbed the hardest day. The Spitfires fought ferociously as Fighter Command grew ever closer to running out of air bases and planes to fight off an invasion, but by the end of the day they limped out into the night, still able to carry on fighting. As the Battle of Britain raged, both sides buckled at the strain of battle. While the RAF edged closer to breaking point, the Luftwaffe's shock losses in Britain not only left them with fewer aircraft and airmen, but also shattered the morale of a fighting force that once thought they were unbeatable. Göring, who had been so confident and boastful about how easily the Luftwaffe could smash the RAF, was furious. Rather than blame his wildly varying tactics or the misguided intelligence he was being fed, Göring blamed the fighters for failing to protect their bombers. He then ordered his fighters to keep closer to the bombers, which was not well received. While the tactic did seem to have a positive effect in some regard, making the fast Bf-109s stick to the slow, cumbersome bombers robbed them of the advantages they would have if they flew ahead in a free hunt, and brought them down to an altitude preferred by the Spitfire. Adolf Galland, probably the most famous Luftwaffe ace, strongly opposed these changes, but Göring didn't listen. So when he was talking to some of the Luftwaffe's best pilots, including Galland, and asking them what they needed to win the battle, Galland replied with, "I would like an outfit of Spitfires for my squadron." Many have claimed that this proved that even the Luftwaffe's best pilots preferred the Spitfire, but this isn't true. While Galland admired the Spitfire and believed it to be a better defensive fighter, like many pilots on either side of the battle, he preferred his own plane. Nevertheless, his retort left Göring in a speechless fury, and it was a sign of the wider problem of the morale of Luftwaffe pilots. In the end, the change of tactic probably hurt the morale of the 109 pilots more than any other downside, showing the distrust that the High Command had placed in them. And it wasn't the only thing.
The name Spitfire may have roused great courage in Britain, but to its enemy it brought terror. They waited, terrified, for that name to call out on the radio. And sometimes gunners would even freeze in terror at the sight of a Spitfire, because if one appeared on their tail in the hands of one of the shockingly skilled RAF pilots, it would usually be the end.
Just as the Luftwaffe were starting to take the upper hand, a revenge bombing on Berlin by the RAF made an infuriated Hitler order British cities to be erased. The Luftwaffe switched targets, from fighter command to the British people. Despite the terror of what would later be called the Blitz, it might have just saved the stricken fighter command. Raids on strategic targets didn't stop completely, but the focus was now on civilian targets. This phase culminated in Battle of Britain Day on the 15th of September 1940. It was on this day, for the first time, the controversial big wing tactic was heavily used, in which many groups of aircraft merged into one large formation. To the Luftwaffe pilots who had been assured that the RAF was down to its last 50 fighters, seeing a charge of 60 fighters in addition to the small groups harassing the bombers, it would have been a terrifying sight. Battle of Britain Day was a huge victory for the RAF, and 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The bombing didn't stop, however, and tragically, on the 26th of September, the Supermarine factory in Southampton was successfully bombed, destroying the work-in-progress prototypes of R.J. Mitchell's Type 317 heavy bomber, and any last chance to see it fly. The short Stirling was accepted in its place. As the Blitz continued, the Luftwaffe eventually moved their attacks to the night. Not even the Spitfire could shoot them all down when it couldn't see. Despite its proficiency as a fighter, it became clear early in the war that the advanced Spitfire had far more potential than just this role, and several photo reconnaissance variants were built to fly over enemy territory and take pictures to gather intelligence. Stripped of its armament and covered in a special paint, photo reconnaissance Spitfires, known as PR variants, could fly higher than German anti-air guns and faster than German fighters, and they became a valuable tool in a war where intelligence played a crucial role. The first major upgrade of the Spitfire came as a result of the new Bf-109F being introduced into the Luftwaffe ranks. It became clear that the experimental Spitfire Mark IV, with its new super powerful Griffon engine, was not going to be ready in time. The 109F was more than a match for the Spitfire Mark IIs that were currently in service, and were superior at higher altitudes. Joe Smith and the rest of the design team at Supermarine had to quickly design something that could fight off the 109F, and so the Mark V was created, being fitted with a much more powerful Merlin engine than the Mark II. Thanks to production problems with the Bf-109F, the Mark V was being delivered to squadrons in time for it to properly combat the Luftwaffe's new fighter, and once again proved more than a match. The Spitfire Mark V ended up becoming the most numerously produced Spitfire of them all, and by this time the problems with the 20mm Hispano cannons had been dealt with a sufficient amount for them to be installed in Spitfires. The Mark V and the Spitfire's subsequent variants had three main wing types available: A, B and C. The A wing type housed 4 machine guns like the first Spitfires. By the time the Mark V came into use, however, this was considered outdated and 4 machine gun wings without cannons were not used. The B wing type was a modified A wing that housed one 20mm Hispano cannon and 2 machine guns each, so 2 cannon and 4 machine guns per aircraft. The C wing type was the most versatile and the most unique. While the 3 wings looked the same on the outside, the C wing was different on the inside from the other 2, being easier to manufacture and also allowing for all 3 main types of armament: 4 machine guns, a cannon and 2 machine guns, or 2 cannons. Often, a C wing with a cannon and 2 machine guns would still have the fitting for where the second cannon would have gone, sticking out, but if it was not used, it was covered up. The C wing also had a couple of other features, like a more stable undercarriage for easier control on the ground. One of the most consequential battles that the Spitfire took part in was the Siege of Malta. Malta was a British colony and a small island in the Mediterranean. Like Gibraltar, it's an incredibly important strategic territory, and during World War II, both the Allies and the Axis knew it would be a hugely significant air base and naval base for battles fought around the Mediterranean, like the Desert Campaign in North Africa. The Italians resolved to bomb Malta into submission, as it was seen as too risky to use their navy, as British naval power in the Mediterranean was still a major threat. With Malta taken, that threat could be taken care of. In mid-1940, the siege began. Initial Italian attacks were unsuccessful, and the aged and outdated RAF Sea Gladiators put up a heroic fight. While they didn't score much offensive success, it was clear that the Italian bombings weren't having the desired effect, and the German Luftwaffe was brought in to help. With only a limited number of aircraft, with the most advanced being Hurricanes, the fighter defence forces in Malta were overwhelmed, and the bombing campaign was far more successful, and crippled Malta's offensive capability. In April 1941, however, the Luftwaffe withdrew from the siege, as more support was needed in other conflicts like the Battle of Greece and eventually the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The RAF were able to somewhat recover and launch offensive operations again, but the Italian bombings grew more successful and eventually the Luftwaffe returned.
The Hurricanes put up a valiant fight but were hopelessly outmatched. The Bf-109Fs even sought to humiliate the RAF pilots, flying in front of the Hurricanes to show off their superiority. Malta desperately needed Spitfires. On the 7th of March 1942, 16 Spitfires flew from the aircraft carrier HMS Eagle to Malta, with 9 more to follow in the coming days. The Luftwaffe, who had just been toying with the Hurricanes, once again saw Spitfires bearing down upon them. Their fear was obvious, for on one day when Malta's fighters were grounded and being serviced, the group captain put a Canadian pilot on the radio and pretended to give him orders, while the pilot pretended to fly. The Germans picked up this chatter, and a cry of alarm went on the radio. In the panic that followed, 2 109s shot each other down. It appears the Spitfire didn't even have to take off to beat the Luftwaffe.
But Malta wasn't saved yet. The Spitfires that were being sent were still outnumbered to a massive degree, and HMS Eagle was struggling to get them to the island fast enough. Churchill, realising that this one small carrier wasn't enough, appealed to President Roosevelt. America had joined the war at the end of the previous year, and Churchill asked if Britain could have use of the aircraft carrier USS Wasp, which could carry 50 Spitfires at a time. Roosevelt accepted Churchill's request, and on the 13th of April 1942, 47 Spitfires made their way to Malta. The Axis had learnt of this, however, and launched a massive attack on Malta's airfield as the Spitfires came into land. Disorganisation on the ground meant that it took far too long to get them airborne again, and many were destroyed in the airfield. The ones that remained weren't enough to fight for aerial superiority, and the attacks continued. Eventually, on the 7th of May, both the HMS Eagle and the USS Wasp worked together to send 64 Spitfires to Malta. When they arrived, the ground crews were now far more prepared and had them ready to fly again in just minutes. The Spitfires were still heavily outnumbered by the German 109Fs and the Italian C-202 Thunderbolt fighters, but still managed to fight back for air superiority, as more Spitfires were slowly delivered by HMS Eagle. The Spitfires were now free to go after the fighters, while the Hurricanes dealt with the bombers. With the arrival of Keith Park, who had been instrumental in helping Dowding win the Battle of Britain, the tactics of the RAF saw massive improvement, and for the first time the Spitfires went on the offensive. It was from Malta that the Spitfire was first used as a fighter bomber, with bombs being attached to either the wings or the central fuselage. By August, Malta had a substantial Spitfire force, and the Luftwaffe commander ordered a massive offensive to finally wipe out Malta's defences. It was a complete failure, and the attack had to be called off. The Spitfire had won again. But a new challenger had started flying over the skies in Europe, and its performance was an unpleasant shock to all those who flew against it. This was no 109 upgrade, however, it was an entirely new aircraft. The Focke-Wulf FW-190 had started flying in force, and it proved to be totally superior to the Spitfire Mark V in all but turn rate. Joe Smith and his team once again had to stop work on a significant upgrade, the Mark VIII, and work on a stopgap measure to stop the absolute dominance of the FW-190. While this was being designed and put into production, it was realised that the clipped wing variants of the Mark V fared better against the 109 at low altitudes but was still inferior. A German pilot accidentally landing at an RAF airfield had allowed the RAF to put both planes against each other, and the confirmation of the 190's superiority put more pressure on Joe Smith and Supermarine to find a solution. The Mark IX Spitfire was that solution and proved to be a match for the 190. In tests with the captured 190, it was found to be a close rival, superior in some aspects but inferior in others. The 190 was more heavily armed and was a little faster at certain altitudes, but the Mark IX was faster at most operational altitudes and could still outmaneuver the 190, although the 190 fared better in a dive. By this time, the so-called Miss Schilling's orifice had solved the problem of the float carburettors stalling the engine in a sudden negative G manoeuvre, but if the negative G persisted, the engine would still cut out. Most Mark IXs, however, would be fitted with negative G carburettors, unlike the one being tested against the 190. Interestingly, the highest aerial battle of the war was between a modified Mark IX Spitfire and a Ju-86R2 Luftwaffe bomber. The Ju-86R2 was capable of flying higher than any fighter that could catch it, and while there were efforts to build a Spitfire that could reach such a height, they weren't much success, and the Ju-86's poor accuracy and small bomb load meant there was no massive drive to build something that could shoot them down. However, there was still high concern about the ability of German bombers to completely evade British air defences, and in late August 1942, a bomb dropped by a high-altitude bomber killed 48 people in Bristol, injuring many more. The Spitfire Mark IX had a powerful enough engine to achieve what the other high-altitude attempts had failed to, and two Spitfires were modified to climb high enough, stripping them of everything they didn't need, including their machine guns, so only the two cannons remained. Even the metal propeller was considered too heavy, and it was replaced with a wooden one. After rigorous training and testing, they were ready. In December 1942, another super high altitude Ju-86 was detected, and a Spitfire Mark IX flew up to meet it. The Spitfire was piloted by Prince Emanuel Galitzin, a descendant of Catherine the Great of Russia. Much to the shock of the crew of the Ju-86, the Spitfire continued to climb up to them, and was eventually able to attack. In a slow and arduous battle that lasted for 45 minutes, and with so little air to move with, Galitzin found it difficult to actually hit the Ju-86, especially as ice coming off the enemy bomber would stop him from being able to see his target. With only one hit in the bomber's wing, Galitzin pulled away and went to land, running low on fuel. Despite the difficulty of the Spitfire to successfully shoot down the Ju-86, it did manage to shoot a sizable hole through its wing. This new capability scared the Luftwaffe enough that another raid of such a height was never attempted again. The Spitfire and its capabilities were famous all around the world, and it wasn't just the RAF who used them. Spitfires would be used in the Australian Air Force, Portuguese Air Force, Turkish Air Force, US Air Force, and in 1943, Churchill accepted Stalin's request for Spitfires to be sent to the Soviet Union. 143 second-hand Mark V Bs, B being the wing variant, were sent to the USSR, but this was not to be one of the Spitfire's great success stories. For one, the Spitfire Mark V had already been replaced in Britain with the significant upgrade of the Mark IX, and so the older Mark V had difficulty fighting any FW-190s that the Soviets came across. The Spitfire also had difficulty on the ground, at the rough, improvised airfields on the Soviet front lines, and could easily tip. In addition, the Soviet tactics didn't really suit the Spitfire's high manoeuvrability, and as the Soviets were unfamiliar with the Spitfire, it was often mistaken for a Bf-109, and there were numerous incidents of friendly fire. These problems aside, Soviet pilots generally praised the manoeuvrability of the Spitfire and their durability compared to the Russian planes, which had more of a wood-based construction. For the Luftwaffe, seeing a Spitfire again would have been a terrifying sight. After their invincibility early on in the war, the RAF had convincingly beaten them back on more than one occasion since, and the Luftwaffe's morale would not recover for the rest of the war. One German pilot, convinced he had seen a Spitfire on the Eastern Front over Russia, told his commander, who told him he was probably mistaken and ordered him not to tell his fellow pilots, as not to scare them and ruin their morale. It must have been like seeing a ghost in the sky. Later on, the USSR would receive over 1,000 Mark IX Spitfires, and these were well liked by Soviet pilots. However, it wasn't really suited to the Soviet offensive tactics and was instead used as an interceptor, especially favourable at higher altitudes where no Soviet fighters could reach effectively. By the end of the war, Spitfire Mark IXs would be the Soviet Union's primary fighter for this role, and it would remain that way until 1947. In mid-1942, the first of a new breed of Spitfire was ready, which replaced the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with the much more powerful Rolls-Royce Griffon. The Mark IV was meant to be the original Griffon-powered Spitfire, but by the time it was ready, the Mark number was changed to the Mark XII when it entered service in 1942. In tests against a Hawker Typhoon and the FW-190, the Spitfire was expected to fall short of the two much more modern designs. But, to the amazement of everyone there, it easily outflew both. All of the Mark XII Spitfires had clipped wings, allowing it greater performance at lower altitudes, as it was built to combat the growing number of German fighters flying at lower altitudes, which was a tactic used to outfly the Mark IX. The Mark XII didn't end up seeing much aerial success, not because it wasn't capable, but because eventually German fighters just resorted to avoiding Spitfires completely at lower altitudes. The Mark XII eventually found better use as being one of the few fighters able to catch up with the V1 flying bombs, which were hugely destructive when they started flying towards London. The Spitfire would play a large role in the relative success of shooting down V1s, with the pilots of the RAF once again showing astonishing bravery, as evidenced by this famous picture of a Spitfire using its wing to tip a V1 off course. But in the end, the Mark XII was a fighter built with a specific purpose, rushed through production because nobody realised just how capable it was going to be. Rolls-Royce immediately began work on a more refined two-stage supercharger Griffon engine and fitted it into the Spitfire Mark XIV. The Spitfire Mark XIV was the last variant to be built in great numbers and was the first to totally outclass nearly anything it came up against. Its massive 5-bladed propeller allowed full use of the two-stage supercharged Griffon engine, which produced an enormous 2,050 horsepower. All Mark XIVs would eventually be fitted with the teardrop canopy as standard, which had been used in the past but never fitted as standard. It was an improvement on the blown canopy of before, as it gave better all-round visibility to the pilot. The Mark XIV Spitfire was the most numerously produced Griffon variant and would be the most advanced Spitfire and possibly the most advanced piston-engined fighter to fly over Europe during the invasion. By the time D-Day came, the Allies had achieved not just aerial superiority, but total aerial supremacy over the skies. Very little fighter resistance was encountered, and the Spitfires sent over, Mark IXs and the Merlin-engined Mark XVs, were mostly used as fighter bombers. After a proper foothold had been established, some new Mark XIVs were sent over. They were one of the few Allied aircraft to have any hope of competing with the Me-262 jets that had joined the ranks of the Luftwaffe, although truthfully they were far slower and not much success was had offensively against them. The Spitfires were able to easily outmaneuver the 262s, and as very few were encountered, they were never enough of a threat to turn the tide. The RAF had their own jets by July 1944, but they were forbidden to fly over enemy territory during this time owing to fears that if one was shot down or crashed, the enemy could salvage its advanced technology. For the most part, Spitfires enjoyed many successes over Europe in the last year of the war. RAF fighting tactics, which had been a great cause for controversy during the Battle of Britain, had now advanced enough to be incredibly effective, making full use of the Spitfire and its strengths. Through the month of June 1944, 152 Spitfires were either destroyed or damaged, but only 21 of these were actually shot down by the Luftwaffe's fighters. The great desert general Erwin Rommel was wounded and removed from command when a Spitfire strafed his car, an event that some have argued helped lead to the failure of a plot to assassinate Hitler. Spitfires also unfortunately had to face American P-51s who had mistaken them for Luftwaffe planes, but were luckily easily able to evade them after the initial attack. The Luftwaffe's last-ditch effort at restoring its dominance came in the form of Operation Bodenplatte. The Battle of the Bulge, the German plan to break through the Allied armies and change the course of the war, had become a stalemate, and it was believed that air superiority was needed to resume the advance. On the 1st of January 1945, Operation Bodenplatte saw the Luftwaffe mount a massive surprise attack on Allied airfields, destroying varying amounts of Allied aircraft on the ground. The Luftwaffe were less successful in the air, however, and only a handful of Spitfires were shot down. Many RAF and USAAF bases were hit, damaging everything from B-17s and Lancasters to Typhoons, Spitfires and P-51s. In the end though, poor tactics and communication meant the Luftwaffe was unsuccessful. It never really recovered, losing many of what was left of its best pilots and too many planes to replace. Less than half a year later, Germany surrendered, and the war in Europe was over. On the 2nd of September 1945, the Japanese formally surrendered. As the Japanese surrender was being broadcast, 12 Japanese A6M-0 fighters dived upon a flight of Seafires, the naval aircraft carrier variant of the Spitfire. One Seafire was shot down, but the attackers were left with 8 less aircraft and 4 damaged, as the Seafires shot down the last aircraft of the war before peace was declared. The Mark 18 was the last fighter to be built with the original wing design, and considered by some to be the last combat Spitfire. By the time it was finished and was shipped to RAF squadrons, the war was over, and so very few saw combat afterwards. The Mark 21 and 22 were attempts to more efficiently utilise the massive power of the Griffon engine. They had larger propellers, longer undercarriage, and redesigned wings, the most visually obvious traits of these being the wingtips, which were less rounded, and the overall thickness of the wing. It was also able to fully enclose the undercarriage, which would further reduce aerodynamic drag. The Mark 24, introduced in 1946, was the last Spitfire Mark.
This is a Mark 24 Spitfire. You can see over the engine the characteristic bulges that you get in all Griffon engine Spitfires. This particular Spitfire served with the Singapore Auxiliary Air Force from 1951 to 1954, where it was considered unflyable after a particularly rough landing. You can also see the double cannon arrangement that became standard on the latest Spitfires. This Spitfire, the Mark 24, sought to solve one of the Spitfire's biggest downsides, its low fuel capacity, and so it has a higher fuel capacity than any of the earlier Marks. You can also see the teardrop canopy that became standard on even today's aircraft. It is perhaps fitting that the S6 stands here, so close to what Mitchell's incredible creation of the Spitfire evolved into. He brought the Spitfire from the ashes of the Type 224, paired it with the brilliant Merlin engine thanks to his relationship with Rolls-Royce that he built throughout the Schneider Trophy races. And this is the end of his legacy. A legacy that Joe Smith pulled along, making sure that the name Spitfire would always be one for the enemy to fear.
Spitfires didn't see much service after the Second World War, mostly being used in a photo reconnaissance role. There were smaller conflicts that the Spitfire was a part of, but in these they were mostly used in ground attack roles and rarely fought other aircraft. An exception to this is the unique incident of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, where Spitfires were part of the air forces of both sides, leading to the only conflict in history where Spitfires actually fought each other. It was during this conflict that an Israeli Air Force pilot claimed the first ever aerial victory for the Israeli Air Force. The last offensive action taken by Spitfires was during the Malayan emergency from 1948 to 1951, where Spitfires and Seafires were used to intensely attack positions held by the Malayan Communist Party. It was New Year's Day 1951 where Spitfires flew their last offensive flight, a strike mission carried out by Spitfire Mark 18s. While the photo reconnaissance versions continued to be used until 1954, combat Spitfires were retired from the RAF in 1952. A successor to the Spitfire, the Supermarine Spiteful, was designed by Joe Smith and his team and put into prototype. It wasn't particularly successful, however, and the age of jets and budget cuts saw its production cancelled. The Spitfire was to have one final hurrah, however, as on the 5th of February 1952, A Mark 19 Spitfire, a photo reconnaissance variant, went into an emergency dive over China and reached Mach 0.96, the fastest a piston-engined aircraft has ever flown even to this day. It remains a fitting testament to the airframe that R.J. Mitchell designed, and indeed the steadfast upgrades that Joe Smith and Rolls-Royce gave it throughout its long life, allowing it to outlast and outfly everything that had once been its equal.
And so that's the end. The last Spitfires to remain in active service were withdrawn in 1961 by the Irish, and the Spitfire became a legend. But it's easy to see why. I read a story about a Vickers engineer who was working on a restoration of a Spitfire in the late 1960s. German businessmen would often land at the airfield that he was working at, and the pilots of those private jets were ex-Luftwaffe pilots. After parking up their own aircraft, they would walk over to the hangar occupied by the Spitfire to pay homage to their old adversary in the skies. They would leave only after giving the engine cowling a fond pat of admiration with the usual remark, "Wunderbar." Wonderful indeed.